Once upon a time, the United States owned a colony, the only one we ever had. 7,000 islands, halfway around the world. The Philippines elected to stay with the United States in the war against Japan. They were bombed 3 hours after Pearl Harbor.
They fought with us, they fought side by side with us, and they suffered very grievously for that choice.
I don't think there is any two countries in the world who have been united as we have been, in peace as well as in war.
The relationship between the two countries is similar to that of two brothers who've come of age.
Our side won the war and the Philippines became an independent nation. But then, discordant sounds.
There was the leftist, rightist rebellion, the communist rebellion.
And 6 years ago, the president declared martial law.
I feel that it was necessary not only to dismantle the apparatus of the rebellion, of the leftist, rightist, and the secessionist rebellion, but also to extirpate the causes of valid grievance in a developing society like ours.
We live by the whims of one man and one woman. We don't even have the right to life.
We have fought for human rights. We fought the Americans in 1898 when we thought that you were violating our human rights.
They are not paying the attention that we would like to see paid to civil rights, to the rights of the individual.
They took the boy from our house and they gave him back dead. And it was not mentioned on any radio, on any television, in any newspaper. The only article was no foul play in the death of this boy.
Our position has always been, we have not violated human rights.
The president decides what is best for us, and whether we like it or not, he is going to develop us that way. It's just like telling a child, I know what is best for you, and you better obey.
But they have described this as a temporary phase, as a temporary experiment to introduce a measure of discipline into their society.
This is American money. If Carter withdrew that money, Marcos would not last 2 weeks. His friends said, now the trouble with electing Marcos is this, that if he gets in, he's never going to walk out. He will be carried out, but he will not walk out.
We've told the American leaders not to take us for granted. We have told them that the new generation is coming to is taking over.
Tonight, where liberty weeps, the Philippines, America's child. A special WABC television news report with Eyewitness News correspondent Roger Grimsby.
A little larger than Britain, a little smaller than Japan. It's Asia's only Catholic nation. It was the only colony the U.S. ever had. The Philippines are volcanic in origin and volcanic politically. 7,107 islands, only 400 of them inhabited. A land whose people number more than 45 million. A land whose people speak 77 languages and dialects. They are a people growing in number by a rate of more than 1 million a year. The Philippines is now in its 7th year of martial law. This, in effect, makes Ferdinand Marcos an uncrowned king with a capricious queen, Imelda. There is little argument that the economy has improved, that crime has been reduced. Per capita income in 1972 was $194. Today, it is $408. The strengthened economy has brought in multinationals. The international reserve situation was zero. It's now almost $2 billion. But where is the money going? Runaway double-digit inflation. An increase of the armed forces by 500% since '72. Given all that, in Metro Manila, home for 20% of the people, the government spent $500 million for construction of 14 new hotels. Manila hotels have an occupancy rate of about 23%. only $13 million on public housing. Thousands upon thousands live in shacks. Manila Bay, one of the 2 or 3 finest harbors in the world, stacked up with ships waiting to be unloaded. Baguio is in the mountains north of Manila, a summer resort kissed by the clouds. But basically, it is a summer residence of the rich. The rich in today's Philippines includes those at the top level of government, members of the Supreme Court. The president has his place. So does the U.S. ambassador.
Okay, to the front for the guys, please. Make your fight.
One of the attempts at nightlife, a casino.
Oh, no, that's so.
Well, I guess I've proven that 7 isn't always a lucky number. But then casino gambling has flourished now in the Philippines. 4 casinos are now operating. The 5th is expected shortly, more to follow. This part of the effort to attract tourists to the Philippines. And it's working.
Now the nation's First Lady is intent on making Baguio a showplace. A part of her plan, anyone who has a house in Baguio, when the time comes to repaint, it can no longer look like this. From now on, all houses must have brown siding and a green roof. And you thought chess was dull.
There's been a lot of publicity given the hostility between Muslims and Christians on the island of Mindanao in the south of the Philippines. Some of that's true. It's not true in every case. In this area of the Davao Gulf, it is not the case. Muslim fishermen living in peace with Christian neighbors. This is the island of Samal, and this is a Muslim fishing village. It occupies about 2 acres of land. About 200 people live here. They fish early in the morning and then sell their catch commercially. Any study of the Philippines must include the tribal history of the islands. Anthropologists have determined that at one time there were over 150 tribes in the Philippine Islands. There are fewer now because of assimilation, but some remain. This is the Taliangun tribe in central Mindanao, 1,473 families. The average family size, 3 to 4. The village chief lives here in Tibi-Tibi. This is the center of tribal activity. Smaller settlements surround it. Farming on a subsistence economy. The dancing and the music greeted our arrival by helicopter. They have a neighboring tribe, the Lanilans. They're now at peace, but there was a time when the Lanilans were accused of stealing this tribe's women. However, the government moved in, and they're now living together without strife. Behind me is the Taliangun Tribal Hall, and it's here that all disputes are settled with the tribal council. Through an interpreter, I'm going to talk to the chief, whose Christian name is Jose. Would you ask the chief what kind of penalties are imposed by the tribal council?
Unsa may kastigo sa mga sa.
Pinagigyapo ko sayon lang yapon na sa tribal council.
If ever there are some accused, they will it is the tribal council who will decide the penalty. For example, will be fined 2 horses, 1 horse, or 4 horses. Depends upon the gravity of the case.
What is the penalty for murder?
It all depends, because if ever there is he's in self-defense, well, still he will be fined only for horses or carabaos and other work animals.
When there is tribal trouble in the Philippines, it usually has to do with real estate. Land grabs in the name of progress have prompted armed conflict with the government. As a matter of fact, it's sort of reminiscent of the Old West in the United States in the war with the Indians. The Manila press has dubbed the island of Mindanao the Wild, Wild South.
When we return, we'll look at Clark Field and Subic Bay, the U.S. military in the Philippines. the largest overseas U.S. military bases are on the island of Luzon. They are Clark Air Base and the Subic Bay Naval Base. Subic began under Spanish rule in 1885, was ceded to the U.S. in 1898, and except for the Japanese occupation, has remained under U.S. control since. It covers 62,000 acres, including 26,000 acres of water. The commanding officer, Admiral Huntington Hardesty.
Subic Bay is one of the best deep-water natural harbors in the Pacific. The bay is surrounded by mountains, which affords excellent protection for the harbor. The mission of Subic Bay is to support the U.S. 7th Fleet, namely deployment of overseas forces and security of the sea lines of communications.
This is the town of Angeles in central Luzon, a rather tacky-looking town, and then many towns that grow up outside a military base are. And this one is situated just outside the main gate to Clark Air Force Base. During the Vietnam War, Clark was one of the largest military operations outside of the U.S. by the U.S.
It's a very large military reservation located almost halfway around the world from Washington, D.C. The mission is to represent the United States Air Force in this part of the world. And we also have a tactical fighter wing here, which maintain the readiness of those forces in the Western Pacific that come here to train at Clark. So it's a very large installation.
Negotiations continue between the Philippines and the U.S. over operation of Clark and Subic. President Richard Nixon offered $1 billion for their continued use. So despite the fact the agreement is not really up until 1991, Philippine politicians consider it to be political suicide to accept anything less. Philippine Foreign Minister, General Carlos Romulo.
Now, if you realize that you've used these military bases free for 11 years, free. Now, don't you think it's a time for us to ask for a rent or some compensation for their use? No, that's all.
Ferdinand Marcos, President and Prime Minister of the Philippines.
As being occupied by the United States without any compensation for the use of the land and without any recognition of the sovereignty of the Philippines over these bases, then you would have a situation where the Philippines would be prejudiced by the presence of these bases.
The daughter of President Marcos has been leading a Yankee Go Home campaign. She's not alone, but a lot of money is involved. Some believe her father has orchestrated the protest to pressure the U.S. In any event, here now are two generals, one Filipino, one American.
The concept and the strategy before really was to have forward bases, and that we were so aligned between two camps, and we aligned with the United States as against that of the Soviet Union. Perhaps you do not need a forward base anymore. You rely more on the Polaris missile. You have your F-111s. You don't need a forward base.
I think Clark's a national asset. My recommendation is that we look long and hard before we voluntarily give it up.
Next, a student, followed by an ambassador.
I mean, personally, I think the U.S. should take out the bases for the because the Philippines wants to declare her sovereignty.
Demands to pull out, frankly, don't make sense to me when I put that up against the reason that the bases are here. The implications would be enormous to our posture in this part of the world.
That's today. Those negotiations are still underway. No final agreement yet. It was easier 4 centuries ago when the Cross and Sword first met on Philippine soil.
On April 21st, 1521, Ferdinand Magellan placed this cross at this site in Cebu. Magellan was to be killed later in the same year in a tribal dispute. But the cross remains, as does the religion it represents. The Philippines, the only Asian nation to be Christian. 83% of her 40 million people are Roman Catholic.
The Spanish religious heritage is a devout, intense, and highly ritualistic form of Catholicism. The Spanish left behind a religion, a language, and several fortresses.
Fort San Pedro in Cebu City was completed by the Spanish in 1565. They were compelled to build the fort because of the hostility of the native population toward the colonial power. It still stands today, but its cannon have long lost their voices.
50 years after landing at Cebu, the Spanish sailed into Manila Bay and built a walled city called Intramuros. Douglas MacArthur had his headquarters here. During the Japanese occupation, the fort held political prisoners. The dungeon. 9 of 10 held here perished. One who did not is now president, Ferdinand Marcos. The Spanish had ruled for 350 years, from the mid-16th century to the beginning of the 20th. But now it was the time of the Americans. We established an education system. English became the common language. We promised them independence in 10 years by a congressional act in 1934. All the time extolling the virtues of a democracy, setting up a government like our own, and building roads, hospitals, and yes, of course, military bases. However, the Japanese prevented fulfillment of the promise of independence in 1944. They did so December 7th, 1941.
We will rejoin Roger Grimsby in the Philippines after this.
These rooms were occupied by Douglas MacArthur from 1935 until he was forced to seek less commodious accommodations on Corregidor. That was Christmas Eve, 1941. General Douglas MacArthur retired as U.S. Army Chief of Staff in 1936 in order to assume as a civilian the job of military advisor to the Philippine Commonwealth. And it was in his study that he set up the first plans for a Philippine Defense Force. As it turned out, it was too little too late. What MacArthur wanted was far from what MacArthur had. He wanted a $25 million budget. He had a $1 million budget. MacArthur did manage some of a buildup before the day of infamy. He had 80,000 Philippine troops, but many of them had never held a rifle, let alone fire one. There were also a few thousand U.S. troops stationed on the islands. And then it happened. Three hours after Pearl Harbor, bombs struck the Philippines. Baguio City, north of Manila, took the first airstrike. The next day, Clark Air Base was targeted. 18 of 34 B-17s and 2/3 of the interceptor force destroyed, along with 26 other planes. Total cost to the Japanese, 7 fighters. On the second day of the war, the daily airstrikes against Manila began. On the third day, the naval base at Subic Bay was decimated. On the fourth day, the Japanese came ashore at 3 points. By the fifth day, the skies belonged to the Japanese. Now her ground forces began a relentless advance on all fronts. By Christmas, Manila was no longer tenable. MacArthur, his family and staff moved to Corregidor. On the 27th of December, MacArthur declared Manila an open city, but the Japanese airstrikes continued. By the 2nd of January, the city belonged to the heroes of Hirohito. Now, the Japanese could concentrate on Bataan. The defense was valiant, but in vain. 80,000 U.S. and Philippine troops held on. January, February. March, they fought. On March 11th, President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to leave Corregidor. He protested, then he obeyed. PT Boat 41. The Battle of Bataan continued. General Carlos Romulo, now Foreign Secretary, was there.
Our soldiers were hungry. They had dysentery, malaria, typhoid. We were starving. We were ill-equipped. The planes, the Japanese planes came and we could send one plane against them.
The fact that the defenders of Bataan managed to hold out until April 9th is the best testimony of their courage.
On April 9th, with the fall of Bataan, the Japanese still had to contend with the men who lived here on the rock known as Corregidor. In fact, they lived in the rock, in the Malinta Tunnel behind me, and in the almost 50 tunnels that lead into it. In her last 27 days, the island of Corregidor received the heaviest land and air bombardment ever taken by a target this size.
There were 11,000 troops on Corregidor, 2,000 wounded. Food was rationed to 14 ounces a day, 1 glass of water.
It was hell. We had 2 laterals that were hospitals. And you could hear the groans and the moans of the soldiers who were wounded in Bataan, taken to Corregidor. No medicines, no disinfectants. But there were nurses there who were really heroines, who worked day and night taking care of the wounded and the dying.
The tunnel is now inhabited by bats and occasional tourists. But those who lived here during the bombardment say it was like standing on jelly. For 27 days and 27 nights, the rock held. But on May 6th, the inevitable. General Jonathan Wainwright ran up white flags and surrendered all U.S. and Filipino forces in the Philippines. The men of Corregidor were taken to Bataan, and for them, the worst was yet to come.
The death march of Bataan began at this point. It involved 70,000 Americans and Filipinos. Ironically, Bataan is remembered more for what followed the battle than for the battle itself. It was the death march. Thousands fell along the way. They were already defeated and diseased.
The death march was 50 miles of hell. Those who finished it did so in 5 days.
This monument in the town of Capas in central Luzon remembers what happened during that march. The Japanese, who claimed to honor military valor, were responsible for an ignominious end for many who had earned that honor. Those who survived the march were incarcerated at a prison camp at this very site, and the monument remembers them as well, for many of them did not survive.
Of the 70,000 who began the march, over 20,000 died. More died on the march than in the Battle of Bataan. With the fall of Corregidor, the flag of the rising sun controlled 1/7 of the world, from Wake Island in the west to the border of India in the east, from the Siberian coast in the north to the waters of Australia in the south. This then was the mammoth objective of the MacArthur strategy. The general decided to go after some islands, skip others. The naval role was critical. The Battle of the Coral Sea, May 7th and 8th, 1942. The U.S. lost the carrier Lexington, 66 planes, 543 men. The Japanese lost 80 planes, 900 men. The Battle of Midway, June 3rd through 6th. The U.S. lost the carrier Yorktown, 1 destroyer, 150 planes, 307 men. The Japanese lost 4 carriers, 253 planes, 3,500 men. The tide was turning. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, New Guinea, The list goes on, and in the mind of the military master burned his pledge, now 2.5 years old.
2 years ago, when I landed on your soil, I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return. Tonight, I repeat those words. I shall return.
General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore at this point on the island of Leyte, and in so doing made good his promise to return to the Philippines, a promise made on the island of Corregidor. The date of the return, October 20th, 1944.
Now, when the pictures of this landing were published in America, one of the newspaper editors received a message from his correspondent in Leyte saying General MacArthur, with General Romulo behind him, waded in water waist deep when he landed in Leyte. And this editor wired back, if MacArthur landed in water waist deep with Romulo behind him, Romulo must have drowned.
People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil, soil consecrated in the blood of our two peoples. The hour of your redemption is here. Rally tumult. Let the indomitable spirit of Bataan and Corregidor lead on.
But at this point, only a beachhead was held. It could have been lost, save for the victory at sea, the largest naval engagement in the history of war. 166 U.S. ships took on 65 Japanese. 716 Japanese planes went up against 1,280 U.S. planes. When the Philippine campaign concluded, the U.S. had lost 966 aircraft, the Japanese 7,000, including 722 kamikaze. The Leyte Gulf affair was over October 27th. It had lasted 5 days. By January 9th, the U.S. was ashore in strength at Lingayen Gulf. By February 4th, the Japanese had been chased from Manila. Manila, a smoking ruin, having been harder hit by the U.S. than by the Japanese in their conquest. No city in World War II was more heavily damaged than Manila, with the exception of Warsaw, Poland. On February 16th, Corregidor flew the Stars and Stripes.
I see that the old flagstaff still stands. Have your troops hoist the colors to its peak, and let no enemy ever haul them down.
At 9:08 a.m. September 2nd, on the battleship Missouri, pens went to paper.
Pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
With the end of World War II, the promise of independence could be fulfilled. U.S. High Commissioner Paul McNutt, with General MacArthur at his side, made good the promise on July 4th, 1946. The U.S. had shown the path of democracy, and the Philippines now began to walk it. It was not easy. Bands of communists carried on an episodic war for 7 years. Then the Muslims in the South evidenced their unhappiness with gunfire. Ferdinand Marcos ran and became the 6th president of the Philippines. Marcos, the most highly decorated Philippine hero of World War II. The economy was in trouble. A black market flourished, as did the old line families. It's been estimated that at the time, 5% of the people held 90% of the wealth. In 1972, the average income was $200 a year. Manila was called a Dodge City. You checked your guns at the better restaurants. The rich had private guards. Some had private armies. Such was the state of this Asian nation with a Roman church, Latin music, a Spanish language with an American accent. The descendants of the Moro pirates have been a problem for every Philippine government, whether the government was imposed or elected.
Islam was introduced in the Philippine Islands in 1380, long before the arrival of Magellan and Christianity. The friction continues. As a matter of fact, during a period of American domination of the Philippines, the .45 automatic was developed. Because of its caliber and impact, it would knock an adversary down. And that's the only way you could win with a Muslim.
We're in a Muslim fishing village in Zamboanga. The Muslims charged discrimination. Some of their own leaders sold land to Christians. Land the Muslims feel belongs to all of them. This has intensified the hostility. Muslims are but 5% of the Philippine population, but 23% in the city of Zamboanga, 90% of Jolo and Basilan, islands off Mindanao. The Moro National Liberation Front claims to represent them. Young guerrillas train in the hills and for a time were armed by Libya, though President Marcos would not name the nation.
They spent $100 million to arm 20,000 men with the latest in assault rifles, mortars, rocket launchers, heavy crew-served weapons, and the like.
Government talks with the Muslims broke down, and now 75% of the Philippine military is concentrated in the Muslim areas. The deputy commander of the Southern Command, General Garano.
There must be some kind of weapon supply operation going on. Where is it coming from?
The weapons now are the weapons that they had earlier. So far, there is very little report of any outside help now.
The Libyan connection has been broken?
Yeah, I think so.
I visited a government fire base in the mountains of Basilan, Campo Uno. The company commander was almost Westmorelian in his response.
We have been crisscrossing the area with the combat patrols as small as squad level. And we could enter any area we could get in and out.
Who are those people over there?
Those are, some of those people are soldiers, some of them are detainees.
Explain detainee.
These are people whom we capture in the battlefield. After some time, we escort them back to their lands in places where we could secure them so that they could return to normal lives.
Do you see any end to this conflict?
Oh, yes, very much. Oh, maybe in less than 5 years.
After 400 years of conflict, this monument at the end of a pier in Zamboanga was erected. It symbolizes Christian and Muslim unity. Negotiations then were making progress. Those talks have now broken down. So I guess the monument is now more a symbol of a triumph of hope over past experience. However, if the fecal ornamentation at the base of the monument demonstrates how the people really feel, there isn't much hope.
Add to the Muslim misery, rampant corruption, scattered communist insurrections, a free press that had become irresponsible and susceptible to payoffs, the black market, unemployment, and violence. The masses were irate. Demonstrators were at the walls of the president's palace and used flaming trucks in an effort to break in. By September 1972, President Marcos had 1 year left in office. The Constitution did not allow for a third term. President Marcos addressed the nation.
As of the 21st of this month, I signed Proclamation number 1081, placing the entire Philippines under martial law.
Martial law. The words chill any lover of liberty, this absolute power that can corrupt absolutely. In the Philippines, its imposition has meant managed press, radio, television, the abolition of the Congress, the abolition of political parties and political rivals, jail without due process, sudden searches, military tribunals rather than courts, all firearms confiscated.
We collected, and there was rendered to government, a total of 650,000 firearms. These firearms included all calibers, including anti-aircraft, artillery, tanks, ammunition, name it, and they had it. They were better armed than our armed forces of the Philippines.
The guns were not taken away. The guns were gathered together and given all to one large mob who now controls the whole country.
Jesuit priest James Reuter, born in New Jersey, but he's lived the last 40 years of his life in the Philippines.
With power, you can do everything else you want, isn't it?
Salvador Lopez, former ambassador to the UN.
I think that's the reason also why he's reluctant to remove the martial law restrictions.
We would immediately consider the lifting of martial law if the secessionist movement is finally settled.
Then why doesn't he just continue martial law in that area and lift it in the rest of the country?
We supported Mr. Marcos in his election bid in 1965 and again when he was re-elected in 1969.
Eugenio Lopez. His family was one of the wealthiest in Asia before martial law. Marcos had him arrested and imprisoned. After 5 years, he escaped and today lives in San Francisco.
8 times I was accused of having participated in a conspiracy to take his life, yes.
Had you?
No, not at all.
Now, in the United States, it's very proper for you to give priority to freedom of expression. But here, in a developing country, where the word of the man in the street is where his next meal will come from, or where he will get medicines for his sick child, freedom from want takes priority over freedom of expression.
Richard Murphy, United States Ambassador to the Republic of the Philippines. Only the Americans asked to see the questions in advance.
Our abiding interest in human rights has, in that it coincided with the period of martial law in the Philippines, has caused some strains in our relationship.
We are for human rights. Even before President Carter took up the cudgels for human rights in the United Nations, we stood for human rights.
It has swept away all rights, all human rights, and has left us at the mercy of a dictator. We live by the whims of one man and one woman. We don't even have the right to life.
Where Liberty Weeps will return following these messages.
Martial law is 7 years old in the Philippines, several months old in Iran. President Carter's human rights statements basically have concerned Jews in the Soviet Union, not the Philippines, where we have heavy U.S. investments, not Iran, where we get 13% of our foreign oil. It would seem that democracy may have died in the Philippines, but Washington is trying to ignore the funeral.
2 military walked into the shoemaker shop at 5:10 p.m. 1 hour and 15 minutes later, at 6:25, his wife got a phone call from the military saying, "Come and get the body." His head was bashed in, his eye was all bloody, he had wounds on his forearms and hands, his trousers were soaked with urine. And they said, "You can take the body and bury him." And she did.
Bishop Clavero, do you have any personal knowledge of anyone ever having been actually tortured?
Well, at least I've spoken to one. This is Mrs. Trinidad Herrera. She's the leader of the Zoto Zone 1 organization in Tondo, Manila, in a squatter area.
It was the police who arrested me, and then the police turned me over to the military intelligence unit. The one officer was ordering me to undress, and that's where they put the wires in my 2 thumbs, and with the wires connected to a small box. And then when the guy asked me a question, he cracks the box. And then before I could answer, you know, the current enters my body. So I had to shout. So instead of answering, I have to shout because of the pain.
In the military, you'll find people who have probably violated our strict standards of conduct, and we have punished them. We'll punish anybody who violates it.
You can never prove anything. When the German bishops were asked why they did not protest against the slaughter of the Jews, they said we could not prove one Jew was killed. This was after 6 million of them were dead.
For 6 years, there has been no Congress. For 6 years, there had been no elections, not local, not national. Then last winter, the Carter administration began applying pressure. The government decided to hold an election, not for a Congress, but something they called an interim assembly. Critics called it a rubber stamp assembly. An opposition party was permitted, indeed encouraged at the beginning. Their leader, a former senator, Aquino. Charged with treason, he'd been in prison 6 years. He even was permitted one television appearance. Mrs. Marcos ran for an assembly seat. Her husband ran the KBL's campaign. Every Marcos rally televised. Election day, April 7th. The opposition party lost.
Mrs. Marcos, on television, went in to cast her ballot and could not get her ballot into the box. She was voting very early in the morning, but the box was already filled.
That's ridiculous. There may have been some violations of the election code, but they were not substantial. They could not have changed the result.
I confronted American Congress, newspapermen here who published that story. Now name to me, let's have specifics, I said. Name to me the place, the electoral precinct, the time, the people involved, the witnesses. They couldn't say so.
Boy, that is a beautiful presentation of the way things are in the Philippines right now, that he should say that. They were the most corrupt elections that I have ever seen in my life.
What I am saying is, in every election, whether here or in the United States, you should expect some kind of
hanky-panky.
Yeah, hanky-panky. You have your Cook County, and we have our Parañaque and others. Now, but they don't change the results. The frauds, if there were any committed in the last elections, were committed on both sides. Let's say on all sides.
We have mistakes, yes. We have defects. But I believe that your mass media have been so unduly harsh to us compared with our neighbors.
What irks me most is not criticism, but the distortion, the actual misrepresentation and falsification of facts.
You send special correspondence here with a slant. And if they don't follow that slant, the story doesn't go through the copy desk.
They don't like any kind of criticism of the regime in this country, whether by local journalists or by foreign.
Is there anything to demonstrate a growing public unacceptance of the Marcos regime?
The night before the elections, they declared noise for Ninoy. It was not just like New Year's, it was like liberation. It was like the end of the war. It was like Armistice Day. The whole city, it was wild. But it was meant it to be for 5 minutes. It went from 9 o'clock until midnight. The whole city. But that was the real vote, the most tremendous demonstration this city has ever seen. This is a young, strong, rising nation. When I say young, it's older than the United States. We had 3 universities when the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. We have Filipinos who are completely capable of running this country. I believe in democracy, and I believe in the Filipinos. And we could run this country. Marcos has just seized power to maintain himself where he is, that's all.
Some closing thoughts in a moment.
What are you most proud of during your administration, your years in office?
Most proud of is to change the Filipino, to change his attitude. Before this, he was not proud of this country. Today, he is.
Are you placing yourself in any personal jeopardy by granting this interview?
You know, if I did not stand up for justice and truth, I couldn't live with myself. I would rather be dead.
One picture I can never forget that is indelibly impressed in my mind is that after every battle operation in Bataan, we would see in the foxholes handsome, blonde, white American boys, 18 years old, 19 years old, side by side with handsome, brown, black-haired Filipino boys of the same age, dead, killed by the same enemy bomb.
Well, that's left some very precious memories, and that's left those of us who were here to develop the new relationship between the Philippines and the United States a very valuable heritage, because there is the memory of a compact of blood between the two peoples.
I'm at Intramuros, the old walled city of Manila. It was constructed by the Spanish in the late 1500s and was badly battered and breached during the liberation of the Philippines in World War II. And now a new city, a new nation has grown up around it. The Philippines historically has been a nation divided. Her islands by the sea, her people by religion, by tribe, and by distance. The effort to find unity in those differences has at times been violent and repressive. The same thing can be said for the United States, and so, given that kind of a glass house, I have no stones. I cannot applaud a martial law fomented fear of free expression, but at the same time, President Marcos takes a Lincoln-esque stand in saying that he is fighting to preserve the Union. You have heard him, and you have heard his opponents. The United States is a third party, motivated by her own national self-interest. Morality and foreign policy are usually mutually exclusive. So if the three ever agree, it will be a miracle, but one devoutly to be wished. I'm Roger Grimsby. Good night.
Where Liberty Weeps, the Philippines, America's child, with Eyewitness News correspondent Roger Grimsby, has been a special presentation of WABC Television News.